In my paper yesterday, my intent was to present biblical foundations of covenant theology. And in this paper, my intent is to give to you historical foundations of Baptist covenant theology. If you're like me, then you enjoy genealogy and family history. And I know that the English enjoy genealogy and family history because you have many different websites, and every county has a records office that promotes family genealogical research. There's findmypast.co.uk, there's ancestry.co.uk, there's familysearch.org, there's many other websites and local resources. One of the reasons is that the English are very good at keeping records. And so parish records and all kinds of things have been preserved and help people to conduct family research. Well, today I want to do family research, genealogy, on Baptists and their covenant theology. Where does our covenant theology come from? And what are its historical roots? How does it relate to other groups that are similar to but different from it in historical perspective? So to develop this, I've put together, obviously, this lecture, but I've also given you a handout with the structure of the lecture as well as names and quotations, so that I'm not just reading quotations to you, you can read them for yourself. And initially, as I was putting together the handout, I had all of the information footnoted, but then it became longer than the front and back page, and I didn't want to print 2 pages, so I eliminated most of the footnotes. But if you'd like to follow up on any of these references, I have full information for you. I'm not making these things up. They're from real sources. And my doctoral work was mentioned earlier. It's entitled From Shadow to Substance, the Federal Theology of the English Particular Baptists. And what I'm presenting here in this paper is really a summary of that work, of my doctoral dissertation. So as you can see in the handout, in the outline, we're going to cover 4 points. First, looking at the unity of Reformed, Protestant and Reformed covenant theology, as well as, secondly, the diversity of Protestant Reformed covenant theology, so that in the third place we can understand the arise of particular Baptist covenant theology. And I want to conclude by looking at what I believe is the wisdom of our confession of faith and what it says, and to some degree what it doesn't say about covenant theology. So in the first place, consider with me the unity of covenant theology in the Protestant Reformed tradition. What is it that you will find in common among Protestants and Reformed Christians in relation to covenant theology? And to understand this, we need to understand at the foundation, covenant theology rests on the distinction of the law and the gospel. The law and the gospel. But the law and the gospel, historically speaking, were distinguished in at least 2 different ways. If you talk to Martin Luther and you say, what are the law and the gospel? He will say that the law and the gospel are contrary doctrines. The law and the gospel teach 2 different things. The law commands, and insofar as you fail to keep it, the law condemns. The law commands and condemns. That is what it teaches. You must obey, and insofar as you do not obey, the law will condemn you. Whereas the gospel does not teach that. The gospel teaches, reach out your empty hands and receive. Receive and believe the obedience of another, the obedience of Jesus Christ. Do not obey and have your own righteousness, but receive the righteousness of Christ by faith. And so the law and the gospel as contrary doctrines that go opposite directions, is fundamental to understanding the unity of the Protestant and Reformed tradition and its covenant theology. This, of course, the distinction between the law and the gospel as contrary, opposite doctrines, was foundational in the Protestant protest against Rome, where Rome, the papists, they would say that the gospel is a new law. The gospel is a law that is easier to keep. Jesus has brought to us a new law that we are able to keep in these ways. It is simpler, it is easier. And Martin Luther and the Protestants and the Reformed said, no, the gospel is not a new law. The gospel is contrary, it is opposite, it is other than the law. So we need to understand the law and the gospel first and foremost as contrary doctrines. To command and condemn, to believe and receive are opposite paths. One gives you your own righteousness, the other gives you an alien righteousness, the righteousness of Jesus Christ. And in the 16th and 17th centuries, this is held in common. Lutherans, Reformed, they hold that the law and the gospel are contrary doctrines. But they will also speak of the law and the gospel in terms of successive time periods. The time of the law and the time of the gospel. The time of the law being before Christ and the time of the gospel being from Christ onward. And this is important to understand that different people speak in different ways about the law and the gospel. But these two distinctions are complementary. The distinction between the law and the gospel as contrary doctrines is complementary to the distinction between the law and the gospel as successive time periods. The Anabaptists taught a grave error where they said in the time of the law there was no gospel. But when Jesus Christ came, then the gospel started in the time of the gospel. So the Anabaptists would equate the time of the law with the law and the time of the gospel with the gospel. Protestants and Reformed said, no, the law and the gospel are present in the time of the law, and the law and the gospel are present in the time of the gospel. So we can speak of the law and the gospel as mutually exclusive doctrines, but we can also speak of the law and the gospel as successive time periods within which the law and the gospel are running hand in hand or side by side. Now, covenant theology is really built on these two basic distinctions. You will see in early 16th century writings, they begin to talk about the legal covenant and the evangelical covenant. You can see there legal and evangelical, law and gospel. And this kind of expression develops further into what we now know and have known for centuries as the covenant of works and the covenant of grace. A covenant of works that commands and condemns, and a covenant of grace that offers freely that which we receive, namely the righteousness of Jesus Christ. And the covenant of works and the covenant of grace, we would say, are different entirely. They are two opposite covenants. Just as the law and the gospel are contrary doctrines, the covenant of works and the covenant of grace are contrary covenants. You are condemned in Adam, or you are justified in Christ. And if you are justified in Christ, you are not condemned in Adam. And if you are condemned in Adam, you are not justified in Christ. And so we see in the covenant of works and the covenant of grace the law and the gospel as contrary doctrines. But the Reformed and the Protestants and Reformed, they also taught that this covenant of grace, this covenant of salvation in Jesus Christ, did not begin dispensing its grace when Christ came and instituted the new covenant. The grace of that covenant was being dispensed or administered throughout history from Genesis 3:15 onward. And so there we see the law, the time of the law and the time of the gospel, the covenant of grace being administered or dispensed in two successive time periods. The covenant of works and the covenant of grace as opposite covenants are built on the law and the gospel as opposite doctrines. And the covenant of grace, whose grace is dispensed throughout two successive time periods, is expressed as the covenant of grace under two administrations. If you grasp those basic points of the law and the gospel and their expression in covenantal terms, then you have a basic understanding of the unity of the Protestant and Reformed tradition and its covenant theology. If you're reading Protestants, if you're reading Reformed writers, they will teach these things. The covenant of works and the covenant of grace, they are the law and the gospel. But our interest really lies in the next point, the diversity of Protestant Reformed covenant theology. While Protestants were united around the idea that the law and the gospel are contrary doctrines, their diversity derived from how they understood the relation between the law and the gospel and specific covenants. And the center, the tripwire for these kinds of discussions and questions was time and time again the Mosaic Covenant. The Mosaic Covenant, the law of the Mosaic Covenant, and the promises of the Mosaic Covenant. How do the law and promises of the Mosaic Covenant relate to the law and the gospel? And as many persons as you ask, that's how many answers you will get. The diversity of the tradition really diverges incredibly at this point, because it seems that the Mosaic Covenant is based on the law, not the gospel. And it seems that the Mosaic Covenant does not promise salvation, but life in Canaan. So what is the Mosaic Covenant? Is it a law covenant? Is it the gospel covenant? Is it the covenant of works, or a covenant of works? Is it the covenant of grace? How does the Mosaic Covenant relate to the gospel if it is the law? How does the Mosaic Covenant relate to the covenant of grace if it promises Canaan? A lot of questions. And again, as many persons as you ask, that is how many answers you will get. So if you ask the Lutherans about the Mosaic Covenant and the law in it, they will say it is a legal covenant. The Mosaic Covenant is not the new covenant. It is not the covenant of grace. It is a legal covenant, a covenant of works. But if you ask the Presbyterians, they will say no. The Mosaic Covenant is the covenant of grace, perhaps under a legal dispensation. The Westminster Confession, of course, states this in its chapter on covenant, that the Mosaic Covenant is the covenant of grace. It is not a covenant of works. So some Protestants aligned the Mosaic Covenant with the law. Some Protestants aligned the Mosaic Covenant with the gospel. In the English context, in the 17th century, there was another group within this overall diversity, and their covenant theology was heavily influenced by the Scottish theologian John Cameron. John Cameron died in 1625. John Cameron is extremely important for understanding the diversity of covenant theology among especially English-speaking Protestants. And John Cameron's covenant theology was expressed in a series of theses which he presented in Latin in Heidelberg, the University of Heidelberg. And Cameron, in these theses, he proposed what he called a subservient covenant. Cameron's view of the Mosaic Covenant was that it was a subservient covenant. It was a covenant of works. It was a covenant based on obedience. And it was a covenant that offered life in Canaan. It promised blessed life in Canaan if the Israelites would keep the law. But it was subservient because it taught the Israelites through their failures that they needed something other. They needed something more. It was preparatory, therefore, for the covenant of grace. It was not leading the Israelites down a separate path from Christ. It was driving them to Christ through their failures. For Cameron, the Mosaic Covenant was not the covenant of works in the garden, though it was a covenant of works, nor was the Mosaic Covenant the covenant of grace. It was a subservient covenant preparatory for the covenant of grace. And Cameron based his views, he based this understanding of the Mosaic Covenant on typology. Cameron taught two-level typology. He said that the Old Covenant, the Mosaic Covenant, is a type and a similitude or a likeness of the New Covenant. And then he distinguished two levels of typology. I wonder where Sam Renihan got that yesterday. He distinguished two levels in typology, and there's a quote here for you. Cameron said, "Circumcision primarily did separate between the seed of Abraham and the rest of the nations. It did seal unto them the earthly promise, the land. Secondarily, it did signify out sanctification. In like manner, the Passover, primarily the passing over of the destroying angel. Secondarily, Christ. So also the sacrifices and the cleansings. They represented primarily a certain carnal holiness. Secondarily, they figured out Christ and the benefits of the new covenant." You can see here the two levels, and you can understand his view of the Mosaic Covenant as a subservient covenant of obedience, operating on its own level, but because it's typological, it's subserving God's ultimate purposes. It's driving towards Jesus Christ and the new covenant. So for Cameron, the Mosaic Covenant was distinct from the covenant of grace, but related to it through typology. And the primary and secondary levels of typology which he speaks about are distinct. They're related, but they are distinct. So in the Lutherans, you find a very hard view of the Mosaic Covenant. It is the law which commands and condemns. The Presbyterians, you find a rather opposite view of the Mosaic Covenant. No, because these things prefigure Christ, therefore it is the covenant of grace in a lesser form. And Cameron really balances the two, in my opinion. This is not just presenting the facts, but me now interpreting the facts. In my opinion, Cameron balances the two very well, where Cameron says it's not the covenant of works itself, it's new parties in a new place with different promises and different precepts, but it echoes the covenant of works, Cameron says. Cameron relegates the Mosaic Covenant to the land of Canaan, and yet makes it subservient to the covenant of grace. Not separate from, but subservient to the covenant of grace. Well, Cameron and his covenant theology was not in his own time, but in the 17th century, it became really a dividing line. And there were many who rejected Cameron's covenant theology, and there were others who embraced and used Cameron's covenant theology. So among the Presbyterians and those like them, I'm using that really as a broad category, men like Stephen Marshall, Robert Bailey, Samuel Rutherford, William Bridge, Thomas Cobbett, and Francis Turretin, and others, they rejected Cameron's view of the Mosaic Covenant. They said, no, the Mosaic Covenant is the covenant of grace under a legal dispensation, or they use a variety of different terms to explain this. Anthony Burgess could be included here as well. They rejected Cameron's typology as well. They did not like the idea that circumcision was primarily separating an earthly people from the rest of the nations, and secondarily pointing out the sanctification, the holiness of Christ's people in the church. They did not like Cameron's primary and secondary two-level typology. And they rejected his view of the subservient covenant, the Mosaic Covenant. Where then did John Cameron's covenant theology find a home? It was among the Congregationalists. It was among the Congregationalists who, by name, specifically appreciated and enjoyed and approved of John Cameron's typology and covenant theology. You'll find this in Jeremiah Burroughs, you'll find this in Thomas Goodwin, but you'll find it especially in Samuel Bolton. Now, I'm going to commit the unpardonable sin and make a slightly negative comment about a particular publication of the Banner of Truth. It's not a criticism of the Banner of Truth. When the Banner of Truth reprinted Samuel Bolton's True Bounds of Christian Freedom, they made an editorial choice to leave out something that Samuel Bolton had included. At the end of the True Bounds of Christian Freedom, Samuel Bolton translated John Cameron's theses from Latin into English and appended them to the end of his book. And so the True Bounds of Christian Freedom, when it was originally published, had with it at the end a full translation in English of John Cameron's theses on the threefold covenant, the subservient covenant. And Samuel Bolton said of Cameron's subservient covenant, this is in your handout, Bolton said, "It is the key to the gospel and the best resolver that I have ever met with all of those intricate controversies and disputes concerning the law. We read often in Scripture that the law was a covenant, and more frequently among divines that we are free from the law as a covenant. But to tell us what covenant this was hath not been the work of many." That's Bolton's preface, or part of his preface in introducing Cameron's theses and Cameron's covenant theology at the end of his book, The True Bounds of Christian Freedom. Jeremiah Burroughs taught the same covenant theology. Thomas Goodwin also, and John Owen. John Owen does not name Cameron, but if you compare Cameron's views with John Owen's views, you will find them to be almost identical. So it's really among the Congregationalists that Cameron's covenant theology found a home and found expression. Years later, in the 1670s and 1680s, when Owen was publishing his 4 volumes on the book of Hebrews, we find Owen's view of the Mosaic Covenant to be nearly identical in both method as well as conclusions to that of John Cameron. For example, John Owen argued that precisely because the remission offered by animal sacrifices was typical, therefore the Mosaic Covenant was not the covenant of grace. For Owen, the typology taught in Hebrews proved that the Old Covenant was not the New Covenant, that they were distinct in substance. And John Owen's commentary on Hebrews is explicit about this. John Owen said, "If reconciliation and salvation by Christ were to be obtained not only under the Old Covenant, but by virtue thereof, then it must be the same for substance with the New. But this is not so. For no reconciliation with God, nor salvation could be obtained by virtue of the Old Covenant or the administration of it." And what Owen is doing is simply studying Hebrews and recognizing animal blood cannot perfect the conscience. Animal blood cannot cleanse the conscience. It only purifies the flesh. Owen is acknowledging the typology of Hebrews. Now, as I said previously, Owen doesn't name Cameron, but this is Cameron's same argument, the two levels of typology and the distinction of the covenants that follows from them. Owen said that the Old Covenant was legal and carnal and had respect only unto outward things. And we can appreciate to some degree that the differences in ecclesiology between the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians, and I'm generalizing here, there's general truth, this can be proven false and true in different ways, but the ecclesiology of the Congregationalists and the ecclesiology of the Presbyterians differs to a large degree because of the differences in their covenant theology, where the Presbyterians are more inclined to make Israel and the church the same thing under two outward forms, because the Old and New Covenants are the same thing with two outward forms. So also they would say the church was believers and their children under circumcision. Now the church is believers and their children under baptism. You can see how their covenant theology is reflected in their ecclesiology. Well, as the Congregationalists begin to posit more discontinuity between the Old and the New Covenants, they also posit more discontinuity between Israel and the church. I don't want to overemphasize that. I simply want to point out that differences in ecclesiology stem in part from differences in covenant theology. And this also has to do with their views of the magistrate and the relation of the magistrate to the church, where if Israel and the church are the same thing under two forms, then in Israel the connection between the state and the church was, to put it in their terms, or put it in the Presbyterians' terms, was very close, was very much one. And so their willingness to use the sword and to use the state to enforce religion makes much more sense in their view of covenant theology, whereas the Congregationalists held different views and a more distinct understanding of the magistrate and the church. Well, having hurriedly and briefly laid out a basic model of the unity of Protestant and Reformed covenant theology, as well as pointing at some of the reasons why there is diversity in Protestant and Reformed covenant theology, this allows us to locate and appreciate the rise of particular Baptist covenant theology, as well as the covenant theology of their adjacent Baptistic Congregationalists. So in the third place, particular Baptist covenant theology. It was mentioned yesterday by Nigel in his talk on John Bunyan that Bunyan was an independent with Baptistic tendencies or beliefs, and that's true. And another term that's been used, proposed by Matt Bingham, is to speak of Baptistic Congregationalists. Many of the particular Baptists, or those who we would now call particular Baptists, they began as Congregationalists and came to Baptistic convictions. And so it shouldn't surprise us, therefore, that particular Baptist covenant theology is in many ways a growth from Congregationalist covenant theology. The first generation of particular Baptists that emerged in the late 1630s and 1640s, they in many ways shared the same roots and the same education and the same influences and the same sources that the Congregationalists did, because many of them were in the same groups, running in the same circles or parts of the same churches. Many of those first-generation particular Baptists were university trained. They were parish ministers. They were priests. They had been ordained in the Church of England, and they had read the literature and studied the theology which we have been discussing. And so we ought to understand that the same lines of thinking that produced the diversity which we have already discussed among Paedo-Baptists also produced the covenant theology of the particular Baptists and those adjacent to them. And the particular Baptist covenant theology also bears the marks of John Cameron's typology and his covenant theology. So how do we understand particular Baptist covenant theology? What made it distinctive? If you take the typology of John Cameron and his view of the subservient covenant, or his subservient view of the Mosaic Covenant, and if you extend the same logic and apply it to the Abrahamic covenant, that is where you get particular Baptist covenant theology. The particular Baptist said the same things that apply to the Mosaic covenant about its typology and its distinction from the covenant of grace, those very same things apply just as much to the Abrahamic covenant. And you can see the trajectory already in Cameron's thought, where he doesn't just point to the sacrifices of the Mosaic covenant, he pointed to circumcision as being primarily separating an earthly people from the nations, and secondarily figuring out, or typing out, as they used to say, sanctification. And so if you take the Congregationalist Cameronian covenant theology and typology and extend it back from Moses to Abraham, you will get particular Baptist covenant theology, where the particular Baptist said the Abrahamic covenant is not the covenant of grace either. The Abrahamic covenant is the covenant of circumcision, and it is a covenant that will disinherit its members if they are unfaithful. It is a covenant with Abraham and his natural offspring designed to bring about the Christ into the world, but the Abrahamic covenant itself is not the covenant of grace. It is a subservient covenant based on obedience. And because of that, therefore, the parallel between circumcision and baptism, though there is parallelism, though there is typology, they're not the same thing, and they're not the same covenant. And so therefore the automatic inclusion of children and the giving to them of the sign of the covenant is illegitimate, because we don't use circumcision to govern baptism, because it's from a different covenant and signifies something else. Now, how did Cameron's typology and covenant theology get to the particular Baptists? I've already said that the first generation were a part of the same theological context as the Congregationalists. But one of the main influences that also bridges this gap between Cameron and the particular Baptist is a man named John Toombs. You may be familiar with John Toombs, who was an Anglican anti-Paedo-Baptist. An Anglican anti-Paedo-Baptist. Yes, he was ordained in the Church of England, and he remained in the Church of England, John Toombs, and yet he wrote extensively against Paedo-baptism. He argued against it and wrote in dialogue with, if you can name a theologian from the 17th century in John Toombs' lifetime, he probably corresponded with them or wrote against them. His writings are voluminous, and he goes after Stephen Marshall and Anthony Burgess and Robert Bailey and everyone. He's arguing with them. And they are arguing with him because Toombs was a respected, a well-educated man. Oftentimes, particular Baptists were portrayed as uneducated or unlearned. And yet the first generation, they came from the same universities and parish churches and were very well educated. And John Toombs, though not a particular Baptist, was one of the important influences for them. And John Toombs explicitly appeals to Cameron and to Cameron's theses on typology for his covenant theology. And we know that the particular Baptists read John Toombs because they quote him left and right, and they approve his works and they recommend his works. For example, William Kiffin and Hansard Knowles and Benjamin Cox in 1645, they recommended John Toombs' work. The work that they recommended, it's the work that quotes Cameron and proposes Cameron's covenant theology as the model to be followed. And it's really Tomb's use of Cameron that pushes people like Stephen Marshall and Anthony Burgess and William Bridge and the others to say, no, we won't go that far. No, we won't hold these positions. There was a particular Baptist named Christopher Blackwood who wrote against infant baptism and talked about covenant theology. And another Paedo-Baptist writer responded to him and said, I've seen this before in John Cameron. So even though Blackwood did not appeal to Cameron by name, other people looked at Blackwood and said, you're teaching what John Cameron taught. So particular Baptist covenant theology was largely based on the idea that the Old and New Covenants are not the same covenant. They don't just differ in administration. They are different covenants. The Mosaic Covenant is not the covenant of grace. It's a law covenant. But that's not distinctive to the Baptists. The Lutherans say that. The Congregationalists say that. What was distinctive about the Baptists was to take these same hermeneutical tools, to take this typology and extend it back to the Abrahamic covenant. Cameron did not do that. John Owen did not do that. Thomas Goodwin did not do that. Burroughs and Bolton, they did not do this. It was the particular Baptists who said the same things that you have applied to Moses, the Mosaic covenant, the same things apply to Abraham and to the Abrahamic covenant. And so the vast majority of particular Baptists in the 17th century believed that the Abrahamic covenant is not the covenant of grace, though it is typological of it, it is historically subservient to it, just as the Congregationalists believed about the Mosaic covenant. And most of the 17th century literature between the particular Baptists and their theological adversaries swirls around this question. They often said this is the main hinge of the controversy, whether the Abrahamic covenant is the covenant of grace or no. But if you take the two-level typology and the subservient covenant of Cameron and the Congregationalists and extend it back to Abraham, then you get particular Baptist covenant theology. If you're familiar with Nehemiah Cox's work on covenant theology, it's available for you in the other room, Cox says, I've written from Adam to Abraham, and then I stopped. And he says, I stopped because John Owen has just published his volume on Hebrews 8 through 10, and I found it unnecessary to write about the Mosaic Covenant. So just think about what that means. That means that Cox is saying, Owen's treatment of Moses, I'm just willing to rubber stamp it. I believe it. But Cox did not do the same thing on the Abrahamic covenant. Cox said, no, we need to advance our own argument about the Abrahamic covenant, and that's what he focused on. Cox's work focuses especially on the Abrahamic covenant because that's what made their views distinct from someone like Owen. But they found in Owen their closest ally, and they believed that Owen's covenant theology led naturally to their position. Not Nehemiah Cox, but previous writers such as Thomas DeLon and Edward Hutchinson, they quoted Owen left and right to say, look, he legitimizes our conclusions. Owen's theology leads to our results. And they said, we leave it to others to resolve the doctor's words to his practice. They said, we don't understand how John Owen can continue to baptize infants when he believes the things he does about the Old Covenant. So even in the 17th century, the particular Baptists were appealing to Owen not to come up with their views. They had already developed these things, but to say, look, here's someone else legitimizing our hermeneutical tools and who ought to reach our conclusions, but simply we believe is inconsistent. And other writers said, you're misusing Owen. How dare you say that his theology leads to conclusions other than his conclusions? And the particular Baptist said, we understand it, but we regard it to be inconsistent. They said, you resolve it. Don't just say we're misusing him. Defend him. Prove us wrong. Resolve it if you can. Let's read some quotations together. These are on the back of your handout, where I want to just give you a few snippets, a few bits of seeing the use of typology in the particular Baptist's arguments, as well as subservience. Typology and subservience are regular tools and arguments used by the particular Baptists in their covenant theology. Andrew Ritor, or Reiter, I'm never sure how to pronounce his name, and it may just be a pen name. We have no historical data whatsoever on this person. It may be a false name, writing so early. I'm not sure who this is, but their book is quoted regularly in that time by other writers, and so it forms a part of the particular Baptist covenantal literature. He argued in 1642 that circumcision was both a covenant and yet also but a sign of another covenant, namely, or to wit, of that everlasting covenant made with Abraham and all his spiritual seed, which is only to be enjoyed by faith. Remember, Cameron said circumcision did primarily set apart an earthly national people, and secondarily did point out a heavenly holy people. And Ritor is making, or Reiter is making the same kind of argument, that circumcision is a covenant for an earthly people, but it's also a sign, it's a type of another covenant, namely the covenant of grace, which is that covenant made with Abraham and his spiritual seed with believers, and is enjoyed only by faith. So two-level typology there is present. Christopher Blackwood, I've already mentioned him. He said in 1644 that the Old and New Covenants are two covenants essentially differing. They differ in essence. The first covenant was carnal and typical, and it conditioned outward earthly blessings on obedience. Thomas Patient, who ministered in Ireland as well as with William Kiffin, he died in the plague in 1666. He argued that the Old and New Covenants differ in substance, and that the Old Covenant was that typical covenant of works, which run upon the fleshly line of Abraham till Christ came out of the flesh of Abraham. Whereas the new covenant, or covenant of grace, is nothing but what God hath undertaken to perform and to work in the creature. Now, Patient, as many of the other particular Baptists did, they looked at Genesis 17, where God says, "But as for you, Abraham, you and your offspring after you, you shall keep my covenant." In the Hebrew, shamar, you shall guard my covenant. You must be faithful in it, which is circumcision. And if you are not, if you break the covenant, you are cut off from the covenant. The Baptists looked at Genesis 17 and circumcision, and they said, if the Abrahamic covenant will disinherit you for disobedience to a positive law, it cannot be the covenant of grace. And so that's why they would call not just the Mosaic covenant a carnal covenant of works that's typological, but also the Abrahamic covenant. And they're not reasoning by consequence. They're saying it's the very text of Genesis 17 that says, here's a positive law for you. If you break it, if you do not keep the covenant, you will be cut off from the covenant. They said, that's not the covenant of grace. That's why he's calling it a carnal typical covenant of works that will run upon the fleshly line of Abraham. The Congregationalists would say this about the Mosaic covenant. The particular Baptists are saying it also applies to the Abrahamic covenant. Edward Hutchinson. These are all particular Baptists, perhaps with the exception of Andrew Ritor, because we know so little about him, but his literature forms a part of the literature of the day that they were using. Edward Hutchinson argued in 1676, and relying heavily on John Toombs, he said that the new covenant is not the same with that of the law, that being of an earthly, this of an heavenly inheritance. And he concluded, whatever can be said of the covenant, the promise, the holy seed, is only this: they were typical, ceremonial, abiding only to the time of Reformation, all these belonging to a first covenant, which was faulty. And the particular Baptists tended frequently to combine the Abrahamic and Mosaic covenants, so that when they speak of the Old Covenant, they mean both Abraham and Moses. And not just the Mosaic covenant, but the Abrahamic, because they would say, between Abraham and Moses, you have the same parties, the same promises, the same penalties, the same precepts. Between Abraham and Moses, you are promised the land, you are given positive laws while you live in the land, and you are threatened with disinheritance from the land if you disobey. They'd say that doesn't begin with Moses, that begins with Abraham, and it's expanded through Moses because the people are about to enter into the land. You don't need a full complex of ceremonial laws or a full complex of kingdom laws for a nomadic people who are still shepherds. But when the people are about to enter into the land promised through Abraham, then God expands their obligation, expands the law, and gives them the Mosaic Covenant. So they saw the Mosaic Covenant as an expansion of what God had instituted with Abraham in the Abrahamic Covenant. Nehemiah Cox stated in 1681, he said, "Circumcision did not only oblige to the keeping of the law, but did also, as subservient to the promise, point at the Messiah, that through faith in his name such a righteousness that circumcision required might be obtained." So circumcision obliges you to keep the law, but also subserviently says there will be another who will keep the law and will provide the righteousness that circumcision demands, and you can receive that righteousness by faith. So it's again two-level typology with subservience. And Philip Carey, a particular Baptist from Dartmouth, who he interacted with John Flavel quite a bit, he argued in 1690, he said, "We do indeed acknowledge the subserviency of the law to Christ and the covenant of grace, but it does not therefore follow that the law is a covenant of gospel grace. The law is not the gospel, nor the gospel the law. And therefore, though the one of them is plainly subservient to the other, yet they ought not to be mixed, blended, or confounded the one with the other, as if they were but one in the same covenant, and no difference to be made between them, only in respect of the different degrees of the discovery of gospel grace, as has been suggested." I love this ending line. "A subserviency in anything to promote the ends of something else does not make it to be the thing itself, the ends whereof are promoted thereby." You see, for our Presbyterian brethren, many of them would say, so long as Christ is revealed in the Old Testament through the Old Covenant, therefore the Old Covenant is an older administration of the covenant of grace. They are the same covenant, the same Christ, the same grace, therefore the same covenant. And the Congregationalists went so far as to say, Owen's phrase is so helpful, no, the Old Covenant saints were saved under the Old Covenant. Christ was made known, yes. Christ's grace reached them, yes. They were saved under the Old Covenant, but they were not saved by the Old Covenant. And so the particular Baptist agreed with that, but they extended it to Abraham to say they're not saved by the Abrahamic covenant, they're saved under the Abrahamic covenant. And they often would say the covenant of grace starts in Genesis 3:15, the revelation of it. The making known starts in Genesis 3:15, the promise of the serpent-crushing seed of the woman, which is developed and expanded and promoted by the Abrahamic covenant and the Mosaic covenant and the Davidic covenant, and yet remains distinct from them. And just because those things are subservient to the covenant of grace does not make them the covenant of grace, Philip Carey is saying. When it was mentioned earlier that the particular Baptists held their first General Assembly at Broken Wharf in 1689, and they published a narrative of their General Assembly. And in that narrative, they advertise, they say, there is a new book shortly coming out by Philip Carey on covenant theology, and that book is the one that we just quoted from here. So the particular Baptist General Assembly, in their narrative, they promoted this book. It represented in many ways their views in general. Now we can see in these brief examples that the particular Baptists assigned a typical character to the Old Covenant, both Abraham and Moses, and as a result, they at the same time distinguish the Old Covenant from the New, but relate the Old Covenant from the New. They're not committing the Anabaptist error of saying the Old Covenant was just an earthly national covenant and there was no grace, there was no gospel, there was no good news. No, the particular Baptists are saying, along with Cameron and the Congregationalists, Israel was a national people with earthly promises, but all of this was revealing and making known Jesus Christ and his covenant and his kingdom in history prior to its advent. So they're not Anabaptists. Their covenant theology does not come from Anabaptists, and they rejected the Anabaptist error that divested the Old Testament of the gospel and the grace of Christ's covenant. What I've just described to you represents a very strong majority in the 17th century. This is the majority view of the particular Baptists. And you can see this kind of thinking also in John Bunyan. Bunyan was not a particular Baptist. We really can't apply that name to him, but he's certainly adjacent to the particular Baptists. Nehemiah Cox was a gifted brother in Bunyan's church. The same day that Bunyan was ordained a pastor, which was mentioned in Nigel's talk, that same meeting, Nehemiah Cox and others were ordained as gifted brethren in the church. Gifted brethren is another doctrine in our confession which perhaps many have lost. He was recognized as having teaching gifts and recognized by the church. This man is gifted to teach in our churches. There were others with Nehemiah who were ordained that day as gifted brethren. And in Pilgrim's Progress, well, let's go back to where we started. The law and the gospel are contrary doctrines, and the Mosaic Covenant, is it the law or is it the gospel? The Lutherans would say the Mosaic Covenant is the law. And Nigel also very helpfully mentioned that for Bunyan, whose commentary on Galatians was extremely influential for him, it was Luther's. So in the Pilgrim's Progress, both Adam and Moses, how do they treat Christian? They beat him up. Both Adam and Moses, when Christian goes to them to remove his burden, what happens? They command and condemn him. In Bunyan's view, based on Luther, this is not what the Presbyterians would say. The Presbyterians would say this is people misusing the Mosaic Covenant or misusing the law or a corruption of the Mosaic Covenant. Bunyan would say, no, that's what the Mosaic Covenant actually does. That's what the Mosaic Covenant offers you, is it commands you and it condemns you when you do not obey. And Adam and Moses for Bunyan were the same thing. In the Doctrines of Law and Grace, in his book, he says that the covenant of works with Adam is renewed. It's made again through Moses. Bunyan takes a hard view of the Mosaic Covenant, that it is the covenant of works remade and republished once more. And you see that in Pilgrim's Progress. So as popular as Pilgrim's Progress is, that means that Lutheran, Protestant, particular Baptist-ish covenant theology has been published to the whole world and is extremely popular throughout the world. The particular Baptists had different flavors on the Mosaic Covenant. Some would say, like Bunyan, it is the covenant of works made anew with Israel. Some would go a more Cameronian approach and say it is a covenant of works for life in the land that echoes the covenant of works in Eden, but is not the same covenant. Either way, they believe it's a covenant of works, but they differ on how exactly to connect it or how strongly to connect it to Eden and the original covenant of works. So if you read Pilgrim's Progress, you're reading Lutheran theology appropriated by a Baptistic Congregationalist. And many particular Baptists taught the same or similar views. Nehemiah Cox was in Bunyan's church from the late 1660s until 1674, and he left to join the Petty France Church in London, which he served until his death in 1689. Well, my purpose thus far has been to describe the historical and theological context which produced a diversity of views in covenant theology, and wherein we can see the particular Baptist views growing naturally out of that same diversity. If we understand Cameron and the Congregationalists and John Toombs, and we understand that the particular Baptists grew in the same context, we can understand their genesis. Well, I want to conclude with a brief discussion of the wisdom of our confession of faith. If you study in more detail the distinctives of 17th century Baptist, particular Baptist covenant theology, which we have summarized in this lesson, in this paper, and then you go to our confession in chapter 7 of God's covenant, you'll find something very interesting. You will find that chapter 7 of our confession of faith does not go into detail about the specific and distinctive points of covenant theology. In fact, we might say that chapter 7 of our confession of faith is not very Baptist at all. And why is this? I believe that there are at least two reasons. And the first reason is that our confession of faith was a document that represented the faith of over 100 churches. And though there was a strong majority view in covenant theology, it was not a uniform view. The Bristol Baptists, for example, tended to have what we might call a more Westminster view of the covenants. And to be specific, I'm referring to Thomas Hardcastle, one of the ministers in Bristol, a good and godly man who also was imprisoned and suffered greatly for the cause of Christ. And in his unpublished lectures on the Westminster Shorter Catechism, Hardcastle says this, question, were those under the Old Testament, the Jews, under a covenant of works? Answer, no. Adam was under a covenant of works, but the Jews were under a covenant of grace. Adam was under a covenant of works, do this and live. The Jews were under a covenant of grace, which was obscured by types, sacrifices, and figures, which did typify and prefigure Christ, and these sacrifices were the gospel they had. Through this they looked to a Christ to come. Through the type they could behold the antitype. Now, if you ask me, I would say, Hardcastle, your typology undermines what you just said, where the sacrifices are not Christ, but they do typify Christ, etc. But putting that aside, we see here that in Hardcastle's view, the Mosaic Covenant is the covenant of grace under a legal dispensation. It is not a covenant of works. It is not the covenant of works. The Mosaic Covenant is the covenant of grace. And Hardcastle's views were not published. These are an unpublished manuscript, which is at Bristol Baptist College. But Hardcastle was a prominent particular Baptist. He was a friend of Nehemiah Cox. He was well known and well connected. And so it's reasonable to assume that there were others who held views like his. But his is the best one that we can point to say there was at least one well-known, well-respected, well-educated particular Baptist minister who held a different view from the majority view, which I have described previously. And we know that the Bristol Baptists were heavily involved in the process that led to the publication, the editing and the publication of our Confession of Faith. The faith of the Bristol Baptists is represented in our confession. That's why our confession does not get specific about the relationship between baptism and communion. And in the appendix on baptism at the end of the confession, they specifically say, we've omitted mention of these things because we are not all of the same mind. And so in order to join with the Bristol Baptists in the confession does not get specific about baptism and communion. Well, I believe the same is true in chapter 7 on the covenant, where we know at least Thomas Hardcastle held a view that was other than the majority of the particular Baptists. And the second reason why chapter 7 of our confession is not very Baptist and does not contain the distinctive points of their covenant theology is because it's not a polemical document. The confession was not published as an attack against Presbyterians or Paedo-Baptists. The confession was published as a defense and vindication of their orthodoxy because of men like Thomas Collier, who had just published heretical views of theology proper and Christology and soteriology and more. They were vindicating themselves and aligning themselves with the Savoy Declaration and the Westminster Confession. They were not launching an offensive against other Christian groups. They say in the beginning, in the epistle to the judicious and impartial reader, so in fact, if you're not judicious or impartial, you're not allowed to read the Confession of Faith. But they say in that epistle to the judicious and impartial reader that they are showing their agreement in the fundamental articles of religion. The finer points of covenant theology are not necessarily the fundamental articles. And so what we have seen represents the unity of Protestant and Reformed covenant theology. That is what gets confessed in our confession of faith. The law and the gospel being different, the covenant of works and the covenant of grace, mankind condemned in Adam, the elect saved in Jesus Christ. That's what you get in our confession's covenant theology. But you don't get the specific questions and answers about the finer points of covenant theology. What does our confession say in chapter 7? Well, in paragraph 3, it says, this covenant is revealed in the gospel, first of all to Adam in the promise of salvation by the seed of the woman, and afterwards by farther steps, until the full discovery thereof was completed in the New Testament. And it is founded in that eternal covenant transaction that was between the Father and the Son about the redemption of the elect. And it is alone by the grace of this covenant that all of the posterity of fallen Adam that ever were saved did obtain life and a blessed immortality, man being now utterly incapable of acceptance with God upon those terms on which Adam stood in his state of innocency. Any Presbyterian or Congregationalist should have no problem confessing that whatsoever, because it simply confesses that all who have been saved by the grace of the covenant of grace in Christ Jesus. It doesn't get specific about the relation to Abraham or Moses and such things. So this means that a diversity of views could collectively confess chapter 7 of the confession. Not that they're trying to include Presbyterians or Congregationalists in the confession. It simply represents common Protestant and Reformed covenant theology. And I think that demonstrates great wisdom. Covenant theology can very quickly, not necessarily divide people, but it certainly divides opinions. And I already said, as many people as you ask, that's how many answers as you will get. So if the confession had been very specific about some of these points, it could have deteriorated or lessened the unity that they were attempting to show at that time. Now, every confession you have to make decisions about inclusion and exclusion. You can't, at some point you have to draw certain lines, no doubt. However, I think in this case they drew the lines wisely. And we can understand that better in light of the unity and diversity of covenant theology in their day. And if you want to understand particular Baptist covenant theology, you really need to go outside of the confession and read the literature of that day, which is becoming more and more available to us in our day. Well, I hope that this has been helpful for you to understand family history, genealogy. Where does our covenant theology come from? Is it Anabaptist covenant theology? No. Is it Presbyterian covenant theology? No, not really either. Is it Congregationalist covenant theology? To a large degree, yes. But it's also Lutheran, we might say. It's Protestant. It's Reformed. It grows out of that natural context. The 17th century in England was a maelstrom. It was a mix of all kinds of things swirling together. And our covenant theology is a natural growth out of the various influences, both Luther, Continental Reformed, the English Presbyterians, the Congregationalists, the Anglican Anti-Paedo-Baptists, John Toombs, Cameron, the Scotsman. All of these things are contributing to form and shape the particular Baptist covenant theology, and yet even they had diversity and flavors and differences amongst themselves. I would encourage you to read as much as you can their works and to appreciate them. They wrote quite a lot about covenant theology in the 17th century, and that literature really died off after Benjamin Keach. I have various theories as to why that is, and we've suffered the lack of that, but the 17th century is rich in particular Baptist covenant theology. If you think that covenant theology belongs to the Presbyterians alone, you're very wrong. You're very wrong. We have a rich heritage that is part of the same family tree with them. Very much so, and has the same roots and the same sources, but we're a different branch on that tree to a large degree. And that's okay. We can understand their distinctives and our distinctives and compare and contrast and sharpen one another and encourage one another because of the unity that we do share. If you go to our Presbyterian or Congregationalist brethren, and I lament that the Congregationalists like Owen really don't exist anymore that I know of, if you go to them and you say, does the law command and condemn and the gospel freely give salvation? They would say, yes, covenant of works and covenant of grace. We agree in that. And that's, in many ways, that's enough. That's a wonderful source of unity. But it doesn't mean that we can't then advance to say, well, let's talk about some of the finer points too, and learn from one another in these things, as our forefathers did before us. Well, may the Lord help us to better understand our own history, our own tradition. Obviously, I've not focused on the biblical arguments that they were using, but if you read their literature, we talked about Genesis 17 a little bit, but they are arguing heavily from the Scriptures. And I attempted to offer yesterday some of the biblical foundations for these very ideas that we see long before Sam Renihan in 2022. You see them Andrew Ritor and Christopher Blackwood and Thomas Patient and Edward Hutchinson and Nehemiah Cox, Philip Carey and Benjamin Keach, and others. Well, thank you for your attention.